My son George has always had the strangest friends. I'm not sure why, but in his earlier years, he always attracted what would be considered the weird kids. I've got a ton of stories about this, but there's one that kind of sticks out like a thorn. He was in the 4th grade, and we had just moved due to my husband's reassignment, so George was new to his school. He had always been an outgoing and friendly kid, so my husband and I weren't particularly worried about his ability to make new friends. We were transitioning well as a family, and everything was going well with him at school. I was beyond pleased the first time I met all of George's classmates' parents, as they all seemed like upstanding, honest people. A few months after the move, I got a call from George's school in the middle of the day requesting one of his parents come in to discuss an incident involving him and another student. My husband was at work, so I assumed the responsibility and agreed to meet with the principal after picking up my son. I remember feeling a mixture of anger and confusion. Anger, obviously. I mean, my son had probably been in a fight, which I'd need to punish him for should I find out he was the antagonizer. But confusion as well. Physical altercations were very uncharacteristic of George, which made this more concerning to me. As I was walking him to the principal's office, he refused to answer any of my questions about the situation, which was also very unlike him. Usually, he was extremely talkative and what you'd call an oversharer, so his silence was somewhat unsettling. I figured he was either embarrassed or scared, so I didn't think much of it. The principal asked that George sit in the waiting room outside his office, so that's where I left him. After closing the door, the principal directed me to a chair in front of his desk, which is where I sat down. He began asking me questions about George, the kinds of questions you'd expect. How is his behavior at home? Does he listen? Does he talk back? Is he respectful? You know, things like that. I had nothing but positive things to say. George was an extremely well-behaved and respectful boy, and that's not the mother in me. I was just telling the objective truth. Eventually, the principal told me why I had been called in. Apparently, George had gotten into a brief altercation with a classmate after recess, a boy named Sebastian. I asked about the circumstances of the fight, and this is what I was told. They had been the last 2 students outside, and they were walking up the stairs together. Seemingly out of nowhere, George pulled an eraser out of his pocket and struck Sebastian over the head with it, causing him to fall to the ground and start screaming. I was baffled. It was totally unlike George to do something like that without being provoked. Plus, I had heard about the Sebastian boy before. George spoke fondly of him, like they were close friends. I asked the principal more questions, but he didn't seem to have the answers, and ultimately admitted that no one had seen the incident, but both boys had independently confirmed details of the story. He then said that George wasn't in trouble, as a little fight wasn't too uncommon. He told me that he just wanted to inform me, and that no further action would be taken, which definitely calmed me down. After that, he excused me, so I left. George was still silent about the whole thing as I drove him home, and only opened up to me right before bedtime. Admittedly, I had grown frustrated with him for not talking to me, which was probably why he quit the silent act. He told me that Sebastian had tricked him. I asked him to elaborate, and he told me that they had been playing make-believe Street Fighter. As per Sebastian's instruction, George had pulled out an eraser for a KO move of some sort. Out of nowhere, Sebastian fell to the ground and pretended to be really hurt. He then whispered in George's ear that he'd seriously hurt him if George didn't pretend like he'd attacked him. So that's what George did, and all the teachers assumed it had been a real fight. Rightfully so, I was pretty pissed. My little boy had been taken advantage of and falsely accused. Instead of going to the school, I decided to handle things myself. That night, I went through the school's directory and found Sebastian's mother's phone number. She introduced herself as Maggie, and I was kind of taken aback by how sweet and genuine she sounded on the phone. She told me she had heard about the incident, gotten the real story from Sebastian, and already reprimanded him. I thought it was kind of odd that Sebastian would have told the truth to his mother so soon, but I was happy I didn't have to do any convincing. She then went on to say that Sebastian had always had some minor behavioral problems growing up, and he'd sometimes think and act like another person entirely. I actually started to feel bad the more she told me. It seemed as if he wasn't fully in control of some of his actions. Maggie suggested that the boys schedule a sleepover to make up for the whole thing and become better friends, which I thought was a great idea. She offered to host, and I was appreciative of that. That weekend, I drove over to her house with George, who had returned to his bubbly, talkative self. Maggie invited me in, and the two of us got to know each other over some wine while the boys played in the basement. Like I said before, Maggie seems like a completely upstanding person, and I really enjoyed her company. I ended up staying for a few hours, and the time flew by. Eventually, I just had to ask about Sebastian's behavior, as it had been bugging me for a while. Her entire demeanor changed, and she lowered her voice a bit. She told me that he often had trouble making friends, and that he's seen a few doctors, all of whom think it's something he'll outgrow soon. She went on to say that he's gotten much better at controlling himself, and the fact that he was being more social at school was a good sign. I didn't inquire much more than that. I just wanted to make sure my son would be safe for the night. Maggie promised me George would be in good hands, and that Sebastian didn't have a history of getting physical or violent, more so just acting strange. That was enough reassurance for me. This woman was clearly genuine, and it actually felt kind of nice knowing that George would be helping Sebastian learn how to make friends. Eventually, it came time to leave, so I went downstairs to say goodbye to George. The two boys were laughing and playing Battleship. It looked like they were really getting along. I kissed my son goodbye and drove home. The next morning, I went to go pick him up. When I got to the house, he was waiting near the door with all his stuff and a smile on his face. I assumed the night went well. I said good morning to Maggie and packed George's stuff in the car. As we were driving away though, he started bawling out of nowhere. I asked him what was wrong in a concerned voice, and what he told me was quite literally jaw-dropping. George said that everything was going well until it came time to go to sleep. The boys had set up their sleeping arrangements in the basement, 2 air mattresses side by side. Everything seemed normal when they went to bed. But at some point in the night, George woke up. He wasn't sure why at first. Then he heard something. Whispering. It was coming from the bathroom. The door was slightly open, and there was a strange flickering light inside, not like a regular bathroom light. As George described it, it seemed more like a candlelight. He listened closer and realized it was Sebastian talking. But he wasn't just talking, he was having a full conversation. George thought maybe he was on the phone or something, but the more he listened, the weirder it got. Sebastian wasn't calling himself Sebastian, he was calling himself Mr. Jim. George felt frozen. It was like Sebastian thought he was someone else, and he wasn't talking to anyone, just the mirror. Then the candle went out. Everything was dark again. George squeezed his eyes shut, pretending to be asleep. A long time passed, and then he heard the bathroom door creak open. His stomach dropped when he heard whispering again, this time right above him. It went on for a while. George didn't understand the words. It didn't even sound like English. He just lay there, too scared to move. Eventually, Sebastian went back to bed like nothing happened. In the morning, he was totally normal again. George didn't dare ask him about it. When George told me what happened, I was horrified. My gut told me this wasn't just a case of childhood imagination. Something was wrong. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I had to tell someone. I called Maggie first. At first, she laughed it off, saying Sebastian has always been a creative kid. But as I pressed her, her voice faltered. Eventually, she admitted that his so-called behavioral problems were more serious than she let on. One psychiatrist had even suggested he was showing signs of multiple personality disorder. They had already moved twice before, she told me in a hushed tone, because Sebastian had been kicked out of school. I was stunned. Furious even. Why the hell hadn't she told me this before? Why would she put my son in danger like that? Then she did something unexpected. She begged me not to notify the school. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to respect her wishes, but another part of me knew that something was very wrong. I blurted out, okay, and hung up the phone before she could respond. I told myself I'd make my decision by the end of the week, but I never got the chance. That Monday, Sebastian full-on attacked another student at recess. It was serious enough that the school sent out a statement to all the parents, though they kept the details vague. By the end of the day, I found out that he had been expelled. I tried calling Maggie, but her phone had seemingly been disconnected. The situation was incredibly unsettling. Just days ago we had spoken, and now, suddenly, she was unreachable. I didn't even know what I wanted to say to her, just that I wanted to say something. There were no other numbers or emails in the school directory, just that one number that was now disconnected. A few days later, the curiosity got too overwhelming, so I bit the bullet and drove to her house. When I arrived, it was completely vacated. No moving trucks, no sign of a rushed departure, just gone. It didn't make sense. How could they have left so quickly? I tried looking them up, searching for any trace of them online. I found nothing. No forwarding address, no mention of them anywhere. It was like they had never existed at all. That was a long time ago, and George wasn't too badly affected by it. In all honesty, I think he's mostly forgotten about it. I haven't, though. I often think about what could have happened to my son that night in that basement, or what kind of things that kid Sebastian has been doing since.